History of heavy metal. Heavy metal's roots began back in the late 1950s when blues music began to influence British rock. Soon bands like the Rolling Stones were creating blues rock, and other bands like the Who are starting to experiment with feedback. In the late 1960s, the fusion of blues rock and psychedelic rock became the original basis of heavy metal as we know it today. The most influential bands to bring about the merger was a British band called Cream. This band got their heavy sound from the union of riffing between the guitarist and the bassist, and usually the double bass drumming. During this time, Jimi Hendrix was also considered very influential during this time. His guitar technique is still copied by many metal bands during this time, and his song Purple Haze is considered by many the first heavy metal hit ever. In the late 1960s and the early 70s, heavy metal sound really began to take its shape. The 1968 California band Blue Cheer covered Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues from their debut album. Many consider this the first heavy metal recording ever. Well, later that same year, the Yardbirds released their B-sides Think About I, which featured a performance by guitarist Jimmy Page at the time. That anticipated the heavy metal sound that he would soon make famous, like the fuzzed out guitars and distortion. In '69, Led Zeppelin released their debut album and reached number 10 on the Billboard album chart. This brought heavy metal into the mainstream and really began to create what Kiss and other bands of that nature really were doing that time. In 1970s, Black Sabbath brought a heavier sound with their down-tuned guitars and heavy reliance on power chords. Deep Purple also at the time fluctuated between their heavy style and like a softer sound, but during that time they were really mainly relying on the heavier sound. And soon metal began forming major metal bands like Kiss, Blue Oyster Cult, AC/DC were also relevant at that time, and they began to receive notice by the public and soon began drawing large crowds. And by the late 70s and early 80s, heavy metal really began to move into the mainstream with the heavily distorted guitars and increasing fast tempos. And they were beginning to reduce the blues elements at this time. And a new breed of heavy metal bands had broken into the Billboard Top 10. These bands were like Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Def Leppard, and these bands were like beginning to toughen up the sound and re-energize the metal scene. And by the late 70s, a new metal scene broke out in Southern California. This is when glam metal really came in, and it's also known as hair metal. These were based out of the clubs of LA's Sunset Strip. And bands such as Motley Crue, Rat, Wasp, and Quiet Riot were using influence of the metal bands of the 70s and were using their own theatrics at the time, and sometimes makeup was being used and really tight clothes. The bands would later become what we know as the glam or hair metal genre that dominated the 80s. Also throughout the 80s, many glam bands were really getting commercial success, due in large part by heavy rotation by MTV in the later 80s, and also the arena concert circuit. Many bands like Motley Crue, Warrant, Bon Jovi, and Europe were getting major hits with their with their music. And like Europe, their song "The Final Countdown" was it really hit number 1 in like 25 countries at that time. But soon in the 80s, glam metal started to fade with many of those, and like they were really into the underground metal scene, and that audience were starting to favor heavier, more extreme sounds. But one band in particular that was reaching many diverse audiences This band was Gun N' Roses. They were considered by many like a more raw, more dangerous metal band. They were reaching more people at that time. During the 80s, another form of metal began to form alongside the glam metal. This was thrash metal. Thrash metal emerged in the early 80s under the influence of hardcore punk and new wave British heavy metal. This style is also known as speed metal by many. The subgenre was popularized by like the big four of thrash. They were Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer. The style was also catching on in Europe, but with three German metal bands leading the way. These bands were also popular among many in the U.S. They were Creator, Sodom, and Destruction. Even though thrash began as an underground scene and remained that way for most of the decade, they were beginning to reach a wider audience. Metallica broke into the top 40 on the Billboard album chart with Master of Puppets, and later they reached number 6 with their with another release by them called "And for Justice for All." Though less commercial success than the other big four, Slayer released one of the thrash metal genre's most definitive records, called "Rain and Blood," and this record was described by Kerrang! Magazine as the heaviest album of all time during that time. By the early 90s, thrash metal had hit commercial success and was challenging and redefining mainstream metal. Though eventually thrash began to evolve and to split into more extreme metal genres, and Slayer was directly responsible for one of these other genres, which is called death metal. Death metal movement in North America and Europe both used elements of blasphemy and diabolism. Death metal also utilized speed and aggression of both hardcore and thrash, fused with lyrics preoccupied what most would find in slasher movies. Thrash metal vocals are very bleak, and they have like low guttural growls and really high-pitched shrieks. They also use like highly distorted, very, very down-tuned guitars, accompanied by really like extremely fast percussion. Following death metal, came another genre called black metal. Black metal really started in the early 80s, but really didn't have much of a following until like close to like the early 90s. And black metal utilizes a lot of the same qualities as death metal, but features also rapid tremolo picking, intentional lo-fi production with ambient noise and a dark atmosphere, and a background hiss. Satanic themes are really common in black metal, though a lot of metal bands borrow from paganism and promote pre-Christian beliefs during this time. Black metal also like experiments with most forms of metal and incorporates this into their music. And another key characteristic with black metal is that a lot of the members like cover their face with corpse paint, which gives them like an extremely scary appearance. Some more like other genres came out in the early 90s and 2000s. Grunge also came out in the following thrash between the early 90s and middle 90s. Grunge was influenced by the heavy sound of metal, but they rejected like the virtuosic elements such as soloing. They thought it was too fancy. Grunge was made famous by like Nirvana and Alice in Chains and Bush. Grunge really had like a short lifespan. So following grunge was another metal style of the 90s called nu metal. Nu metal incorporated everything from like death metal to hip hop and they often, many bands included DJs and rap style vocals. Major bands of this genre was like POD, Korn, Papa Roach, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot, and I believe Linkin Park was also in there. This mixture showed that pan-cultural metal could pay off. New metal gained mainstream success during the late 90s and early 2000s by heavy rotation by MTV, and also in the mid-90s the introduction of Ozzy Osbourne's Ozfest, which is like a huge metal festival. They have featuring many different styles of heavy metal. In more recent years, a few more genres of metal came about. The first is Metalcore. It was originally a hybrid of thrash and hardcore punk. Throughout the 90s, Metalcore was mainly underground and really didn't get like any kind of commercial success. And until 2004, when like kind of a style of Metalcore came out, it was called melodic Metalcore, and it was also influenced by melodic death metal, along with hardcore and thrash. It was popular enough that bands in 2004 were getting like really high in the Billboard album chart, like around 21 and 22 was like the highest that bands of this genre had reached so far. The next genre to break out recently is retro metal. This genre was made popular by Wolfmother and Airborne, and they created like this eerie combination of 80s metal and 70s glam, and it really just sounds like something that really came out of the 70s. I mean, and it's just really crazy. And finally, another genre that is starting to get a lot of attention is deathcore, and it's my favorite genre. Deathcore is a hybrid of death metal and American hardcore, and deathcore borrows like vocals and the distorted guitars from death metal, and it borrows the breakdown from hardcore. The breakdown is like during the song, like when everything slows down, it's just heavier and grittier and just more intense. And deathcore really has its roots way back in the 80s with a German metal band called Blood. They first used the breakdown. They were more death metal at the time, but they really started to use the breakdown, and they also had an album called Deathcore. Deathcore has remained mainly underground until like here recently, when bands like Bring Me the Horizon, Upon a Burning Body, and Whitechapel like really started like getting out there and like putting deathcore on the map. And they started recently playing large festivals like Mayhem Festival and Vans Warped Tour. And Vans Warped Tour is mainly like punk rock oriented, and so they're really starting to put deathcore on the map. And for my visual aids, I've posted some links in the description bar that really is like some of my favorite videos and metal bands, and really shows how diverse heavy metal is. So that's it.